On today's edition of Pipeline Things, the first of a two-part series, we cover what is arguably one of the most defining events in pipeline integrity. A 600-foot crater, 108 affected homes, 8 people are killed, 10 serious injuries, 48 sustained minor injuries. Unsure of whether it is a plane crash or a pipeline explosion that has happened in the middle of a heavily populated suburb. You probably already know what event we're talking about. So join us to see what the impacts are of this major event, both on the community and in the regulations that follow. Boom. All right. Welcome to today's episode of Pipeline Things. I am your host, Rhett Dotson, my co-host, Mr. Christopher De Leon, and we are excited to be with you on this journey as we go through, let's say, the origins of what you call modern regulation, I believe. Yeah. As you guys know, this is the...
It's like an origin story. I like origin stories.
It is kind of like a good origin story. It's like this is going to be the third episode today. And I'll say, today's episode, there are two challenges with today's episode, Chris. One is the content itself, because it's so, when you take on something as significant as San Bruno, which is our topic today, you feel the weight of it. You're like, oh God, I can't halfway do this. Like, I need to give this the attention, the justice that it deserves. The second one is it's so much material. So I kind of feel like sometimes maybe I understand why people don't read NTSB reports.
Where to hone in, right? Where do you hone in?
Yeah, so I took 137 pages of NTSB material, and in my first stab, I boiled it down to 16 pages, and in my second stab, I got it down to 10. Yep. So audience, you're with us for 10 pages of Rhett's condensed notes of the NTSB failure on San Bruno.
Yeah.
You don't seem excited by that.
Well, it's because I've seen you present. If any of you have ever been in a presentation with Rhett, he has a style, right? It's like a ton of content, and he goes really, 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 really fast. And it's like, that was fantastic. I heard and learned a lot, but I'm not sure if I can apply.
So I'm not going to listen to this on 1.1. I'm going to listen to this on 0.9 just to slow Rhett down.
Yeah. So I'll try to pull out the stuff that maybe we should talk about a little bit. But go ahead, brother.
So this event, San Bruno, I'll say, what's really interesting about it, Chris, for me, is I'm going to say, maybe, I don't want to call it fortune, because I don't think it's fortune, but I've had the unique position of being a part of two industries and seeing events that defined those two industries. So for me, San Bruno is to the pipeline industry what the Deepwater Horizon was to the offshore. I think the difference between, because I worked at both, so I came from I was actually in the process of transitioning.
It feels like the modern definition, maybe. I do want to qualify that a bit, because the Olympic failure also had a pretty significant impact.
But I wasn't. Yeah. I was in school when that was going on.
My point is, it's like, unfortunately, we've had these milestones, right? These milestone events that have also kind of refined or further shaped us, if that makes sense, right?
But the difference is you and I were both working. Well, I was a working professional at this time. Yeah. I had actually been working already for around 6 years. Yeah. And I do remember when this happened, but I wasn't as invested in the natural gas industry at the time.
Yeah, I was a natural gas operator, learning a whole lot about inline inspection and pipeline integrity.
And but again, nobody working in the offshore industry is unfamiliar with what happened in Deepwater Horizon. Yeah. I think it's safe to say that we want to make sure all of our listeners, certainly any engineer who comes into gas pipeline integrity, should know about San Bruno.
I'll go another way. I'll actually challenge to say anybody who is in pipelines should know about Marshall, Michigan and San Bruno as a minimum.
Yes.
Because of the impact it had on modern regulations, right? I mean, we see this time and time again. We're working with a liquid pipeline, and we'll see gas regulations as a reference.
Yeah.
I mean, right, they're really cross-talking a lot now, right? That boundary of, well, this is a liquid reg versus this is a gas reg. We're kind of seeing how some of maybe the advancements of control or more stringent regulations just happened first on the gas side, right? And obviously we're going to talk about how San Bruno has influenced that, but we're seeing a lot of that crosstalk. Yeah. So if you're in pipeline, specifically in pipeline integrity, or pipeline integrity is somehow influencing your day-to-day, these Marshall, Michigan and San Bruno are absolutely impacting how you operate in one way or another.
And hopefully, again, one of the things we heard said is that the only thing we learn from our failures is that we don't learn from our failures. Hopefully, any of our listeners, we know a lot of them out there are involved in pipeline integrity. Yeah. You hear this and it's just a good chance to be reminded of like, oh, wow. It's kind of like when you're driving on the interstate and you pass that speed sign, you're like, oh, yeah, that's the speed limit here. I need to be reminded that I need to slow down. That's for you.
No, I have a better one than that when I'm driving. Mine is like when I get the low fuel signs, like my truck tells me, 60 miles till E, 59 miles till E, and then it says low fuel, right? Some people would just go get fuel, right? I'm like, no, like I've got at least 32 miles left at my average driving velocity. I'm like, this is okay. I don't need to feel pressure to go get gas all of a sudden.
That worked well for you until you drove a different truck, right? Not all trucks.
That is 100% true, and we're going to see some of that. In I think that's a great segue actually into this, right? Is it's whether it's recency bias or we've always done it that way. When you try to apply that a different way, it might not work out the way you want.
So without further ado, we're going to jump in. So I want to take the audience back September 9th, 2010, wherever you were at that point in time. I want you to remember it's 6:11 p.m. That's when this story, the incident occurs. We're actually going to start a little bit before that. And we're going to talk a little bit about where the pipeline in question comes from and what it is. So we're talking about what's known as line 132. Line 132 is part of a bigger system, and we're going to be talking about segment 180 within line 132.
Yep.
Okay. So this is a 30-inch diameter segment. Operated by PG&E that runs in San Bruno. So what I want you to know is, again, the segment we're talking about is 180, but the report refers almost exclusively to line 132. And this segment is within line 132. Line 132 originates in the Milpitas terminal and flows to the Martin station. So for our audience up there, that's going from south to north in a peninsula in California, right? So gas is flowing from south to north. The line 132 is actually part of a 3-line looped system. So there are actually 3 tangential lines that run next to each other. I don't know if tangential was the right word there. Maybe side by side.
We'll say
3 side by side lines. Lines 101 and 109 and 132. Yeah. And they have 6 cross ties in between them. So these are heavily interconnected lines, which is one of the issues that comes into play here, we'll say, that allows gas to flow in between all of these lines. But they all leave from the Milpitas terminal and flow to the Martin station.
Yep.
What's interesting about that is that line 132, again, is composed of multiple diameter segments. So it's got a 24, 30, 34, and 36-inch diameter segments. Yep. So all of those segments exist within the system that is line 132.
Yeah.
Okay. And
between Milpitas
and Martin. Yes.
And
correct.
So let's just say if you wanted to put an ILI tool in there, it would have to try to navigate all those nominal pipe sizes, all those diameters.
Right. And that's obviously,
that's another discussion, but we're just trying to frame this for an integrity engineer, right? Is it's like, are those multiple segments? Is it one? Just keep that in mind, right? You've got all these diameter changes.
And so again, this was the difference between those two is a little over 40 miles. Mm-hmm. And so it's interesting. That would traditionally be a piggable segment, but this is not a piggable system.
Could be. Yeah, it could be. It's within the range
in terms of length, but it's definitely not a piggable segment.
Yeah.
And this is the 30-inch segment that we're talking about here. But even that segment has multiple weld types. And it's really important that one section of it was relocated in 1956 to accommodate residential construction. That section that was relocated within line 132 was about 1,800 feet long, right? And PG&E actually directly performed that work. They didn't contract it out. Mm-hmm. So what PG&E believed was in the ground, if you had asked them at the time, was 30-inch diameter, seamless pipe material, API 5L X42, nominal wall thickness 375, installed in 1956. So PG&E, according to their records, believed that it had been part of the relocation project. They did not know the manufacturer. And the line operated, all this is important information, the line operated at 400 PSI. That was the MAOP. They had a self-imposed maximum operating pressure of 375 due to some other piping in the system. So just to set the stage, that means that we're operating at a hoop stress of about 16,000 PSI, which is about 38% of the listed SMICE. For most of us that are out there, this is not what we would consider to be, we think about transmission pipelines. A lot of times we're thinking about things that are operating north of 50% SMICE, maybe as high as 72%, right? But in a very heavily populated area. Okay. All right. Any questions about the system from you, Chris?
So far, so good. I think we understand what's going on. You've done a great job. So I think the only thing I would add is if you've ever flown into San Francisco, you've basically seen San Bruno. Because it is right adjacent to the SFO airport. I mean, so it's densely populated. San Bruno is not rural by any means. It is very urban, densely congested, lots of family neighborhoods, all that fun stuff. So as part of this, if you're listening, if you're at your computer, I would say, Google and take a look at the incident. I mean, the picture, it really sets the stage for what we're going to talk about today.
Yep. And so, again, as I mentioned, now I want to walk backwards from the failure. So the failure itself occurred at 6:11, but we're not there yet. The story begins closer to around 4:30 that afternoon. And like all the failures we've talked about, the control center and the SCADA systems come into play. Maybe not as much as some of the other ones, but we're going to see a lot of things occurring around that. So around 4:30, they have some electrical work that's taking place on the uninterruptible power supply, right? So they are actually transferring loads to incorporate a new UPS system. And during that time, the report goes into detail. They're having to change valves over from automatic to manual. None of that initial work is actually pertinent to the failure other than that it wasn't documented properly. And it does, again, create this dialogue that's happening between the people that are doing the work and the SCADA center. But they do know that prior to the failure, they had put the valves back into the automatic position. The next stage of work, what happens is that the workers removed power from an unidentified breaker. So it was an unidentified breaker. They didn't know what it controlled. They shut off the loads from the breaker, and then they immediately noticed that some of the displays in this local panel go blank, and they start getting erroneous low pressure signals to the valve controllers. So they're getting erroneous signals to the valves. In order to prevent anything from going crazy, the valves actually will lock in a fully open position, is what happens. So the valves, because they shut off this breaker, go to a fully open position, and that means that the only means of accidental overpressure becomes monitor valves that are further down the line. Right. Again, the report goes in a lot of detail, and it's not going to be too critical to our discussion, but it is important because when they shut off that breaker, what happens is at around 5:22 p.m., so we're still a little less than an hour before the failure, let's say that the SCADA system alarm panel goes nuts. Within a few seconds, we see 60 alarms happening. There are controller error alarms, high differential pressure, and high pressure alarms on several of the lines coming out of the Milpitas terminal, including line 132. At 5:25, the SCADA operator actually calls the Milpitas technician and says, "Hey, these signals look real. What's going on?" Right? But they realized that this time that whole panel had gone black, and so they realized, hey, it's something related to what we've done. And they're also noticing that the SCADA data is inconsistent. So they're getting all these high pressure alarms, but they're seeing constant pressures on the downstream lines. So they're not sure what's going on. What's interesting, again, is we see confusion in the SCADA center just prior to an incident, right? All of it related to some electrical power work. So this begins a conversation between SCADA and the Milpitas technicians that are performing the work. They begin to realize that the SCADA data, the SCADA center is not receiving valid information from the Milpitas terminal, which is why all the alarms are going off. The monitor valves, which remember I told you that last line of defense, were set at 386 PSI. But there's a delay between when the monitor valves record time and when it gets sent to the SCADA system that creates more confusion. And so basically, they get concerned that they're overpressuring the system at around 5:30, and the Milpitas technician says, hey, can I reduce the local set point on the monitor valves from 386 PSI to 370 because I want to bring the line pressures down.
Yeah.
And again, they're still trying to figure out what's going on. So between 5:28 and 5:52, the conversation continues between the technician and the SCADA center, the SCADA data operator. He basically asked the Milpitas technician to place a physical gauge on line 132 so that he can sort out what's going on. And he gets a reading of around 396 PSI, which again is higher than they had been operating. It actually leads the operator at the SCADA center to make the statement, we have a major problem at Milpitas and we've overpressured the whole peninsula. So at this point, they're honestly really not sure what's going on.
Yeah.
But they get a few more readings on line 132 and they see that it brings it down to around 386. So at about 6 o'clock, right around the time the failure happens is when SCADA is coming off of their high craziness, thinking that, okay, all of this work that was taking place has upset the SCADA system, but it looks like things are normalizing.
Yeah.
Problems under control. We're good. Unfortunately, we know that's not the case.
Yeah.
Shortly after the 611, line 132 ruptures. This is only about 10 minutes after those other events that occurred to you. So again, keep in mind in the last 30 minutes is when all these conversations have been going back and forth. They're trying to figure out what's going on. And then that's when the very first low pressure alarm for line 132 goes off, 6:15, which is after the failure. And it happens at the Martin station, which is downstream. 20 seconds later, they get another low pressure alarm and the system has come down to 150 PSI. By 6:36, only 20 minutes later, the pressure at the Martin station was 50 PSI. So things have changed quickly, but between that time of 6:15 and 6:30, the SCADA operators are still unaware that they've had a failure. Right?
Yeah.
So let's take boots on the ground, what's actually happened. We know that at 6:11 a failure happened. On the ground, what takes place is the firefighters see the explosion happen from like almost across the street. They end up immediately on scene and taking care of things at 13 p.m., right? So within 2 minutes, you have firefighters on scene, and I'll say the NTSB report says that the emergency response is like on point throughout all of this. So kudos to emergency response.
And just to give you perspective, when you say the emergency response saw this almost immediately.
Local fire. Local
reports
EMS.
are that the flame reached approximately 300 feet in the air.
Yep.
I mean, so this is significant.
Yep.
And again, you are in a very urban populated location, so you've got the attention of people now. So
Yep.
what do you do?
So this is when I think a lot of, remember the failure happened at 6:11. I'm going to take you to around 6:27. So we're 16 minutes in or so. SCADA and operations are still not aware of what's going on, right? I think if you took all the incidents related to the electrical stuff out, they probably would have recognized they had a failure incident or immediately.
Yeah.
But they're confused because of all the other stuff that was happening. Around this time, somehow, because emergency response was on scene and they're not sure what happened, they actually come to the conclusion that a jet has fallen or has crashed from the local San Francisco airport. Yep. And it begins to circulate that the fire is actually due to a jet plane that has crashed in the area rather than a line. And that rumor actually makes its way into the SCADA system or the SCADA control center eventually. At 6:27, a dispatcher calls SCADA to see if they've seen a pressure drop. And the operator says, hey, we haven't seen any calls about this incident. But again, keep in mind, emergency response is already on scene, right? Yep. There were reports of a plane crash or a gas station explosion or some combination of the two. That's, again, I've already told you going through the terminal right now. But within 3 minutes, by 6:31, within 4 minutes of receiving that call, SCADA recognizes that they've had a failure, right? And in fact, the SCADA operator reports there's been a major pressure drop at a station near San Bruno, of course, referring to the Martin station. So they're putting the pieces together by 6:30 that they have a failure. This is where, unfortunately, between 6:30, it takes another hour before the gas is actually shut off, right? And that gas shut off is kind of a cool side story, an amazing side story, I'd say, in here.
Yeah.
The way it happens is, again, you have 6:30 p.m., one of the local PG&E measurement and control mechanics, he's actually off of work, but was qualified to operate the mainline valves. He sees the media reports and suspects a transmission break. So he notifies the dispatch center and then immediately goes to what's known as the Colma yard. This mechanic arrives there at around 6:50, and he waits for the second mechanic to arrive. These two guys get together with a map of the system. They're looking at where the incident has occurred. They're looking at the system. They come to the conclusion before anyone else that line 132 has failed.
Yep.
Before operations confirms it to them, before SCADA confirms it to them, they are convinced that it's line 132. They call their supervisor and say, hey, we're going to isolate the valve. Will you give us permission? The supervisor permits them to do it. They go out there and then manually shut the upstream valve, meet the supervisor, go to the downstream valve, and shut off that valve, effectively isolating the gas flow. And then they actually have to shut off they have to pinch off a few distribution mains to fully contain the flow. But that takes them a while because they have to leave from 6:50, go to the first station, shut off the valve, drive to the second station, shut off the valve. What's amazing is that the NTSB report says that mechanics 1 and 2 were unnecessarily held at the yard, and the response could have been delayed even longer if the two mechanics had awaited from official orders from PG&E. Further, the SCADA center staff could have reduced the flow sooner by shutting the remote valves at the Martin station, but they did not. These delays needlessly prolonged the release of gas and prevented emergency response from accessing the area.
Yeah.
I say it's cool simply because you have these two guys that kind of took matters somewhat into their own hands and ended up on site.
That's always a complicated situation, right? How many, even in some very recent catastrophic events, right, that you and I have talked about at length in our personal time, right, is it's where if you are competent and there is an opportunity, at what point do you wait for instruction and follow process, right? So, but we'll leave that maybe for a different podcast.
Yeah, it's a whole nother, again, a lot of the NTSB report, if you read it, goes into detail of the lack of unified command at SCADA. We don't want to get into that. I'm going to say it's outside the scope of this podcast.
Our goal here is for you guys to understand what happened, and then the second phase of this obviously is to talk about now how does this impact us and what we do.
But suffice it to say, all the way up until 7 o'clock, even after the mechanics have left to go close the valve, the operators within the control center are still responding to the rumor that it's a plane crash. And one of them says, it's easy to believe it's a plane crash. We still have an indication that it is a gas line break, and we're going to stay with that. If you talk to the fire department, I would inform them of that. So there were still people trying to say, even after SCADA had the data, they believed that it was a break. They were still trying to say, oh no, this is potentially a plane crash, right? And again, you see that it unfortunately delayed some of the response, right? Ultimately, the gas isn't fully stopped until close to 7:57 p.m. A full 90 minutes. And the significance of that, again, remember that I told you, is by 7:57 p.m. they stopped gas flow. Well after 90 minutes, but by 6:30 they had indications that it was, with the line pressure going down, that a line break had happened. But unfortunately, there were no automatic shut-off valves. There were no remote shut-off valves. The only way to shut this off was due to the actions of the two mechanics that were going around doing this.
Qualified personnel on site.
Yep. And this is one of the major findings. Again, we're not going to talk about it at length, Chris. But the NTSB says that the use of either automatic shutoff valves or remote control valves would have reduced the amount of time taken to stop the flow of gas by at least 1 hour. The outcome is the NTSB recommends to amend Title 49 CFR 192 to directly require that automatic shutoff valves or remote control valves in high consequence areas be installed and spaced at intervals that consider the factors listed in the regulation. We know that conversation has been ongoing even until today. That conversation continues, but it was a direct outcome of it's I'd say it's the first of our direct outcomes, but again, not one that we're going to spend a lot of time talking about. So what happened? What were the outcome of this? Again, if you mentioned looking at the pictures, I'll give you a visual picture. Most of us live in subdivisions of closely spaced homes. This is no different, right? So maybe if you live in a standard master plan community, walk out in your backyard, and I want you to imagine a crater 72 feet wide, and 72 feet long and 26 feet wide. That's the crater that blew out of the ground. Imagine a section of pipe 28 feet long and weighs 3,000 feet, blown 100 feet into your neighbor's yard.
Weighs 3,000 pounds. Continue.
Weighs 3,000 pounds. Look around you and find the nearest 38 homes and level all of them. Because this fire destroyed 38 homes and damaged 70. It ended up killing 8 people. They had 10 serious injuries and 48 minor injuries. They ended up excavating 300 homes. Evacuating 300 homes. And the fire damage extended for a 600-foot radius, affecting 108 homes. That's the extent of the damage, right? Catastrophic and occurring within a heavily populated area. The repair cost at the time, and we know it went way beyond this. The line at the time actually wasn't going to be repaired, would have been $13,500,000. We know that the actual cost far exceeded that. So, again, I think tragedy, I'd say it's astonishing, right? When you see that 700-foot crater and what happened there, and it's a memory of what we don't ever want to happen again. So
it's a bit of a social license, right? Because you could argue, out of all those homes, how many of those people were aware of the risks? And I don't even mean the risk of what that the NTSB uncovers. Just the fact that there is a high pressure pipeline, even if it's operating under 50% SMICE, the fact that it's there is a duty of care, right? There is a social license that we all take in being in this industry, right? And I know, we do a lot better with public awareness and call before you dig. But, when you have over 300,000 miles of transmission pipe, I mean, it's just, there's a lot of responsibility that we take.
I think this particular incident, Chris, definitely highlights that when one of us fails, all of us fails. I don't think the people there cared who the operator was. You see the public noticeably upset and I think it's because it's so relatable. The reason I tell everybody to walk outside and imagine a 600-foot crater is many of you may not realize where these pipelines are. They did find, again, the report goes into great detail about public awareness. It's a great read. But the majority of the public remains largely unaware, fortunately, I will say largely unaware of the gas assets that exist under their homes. And that's how we would like them to be. We don't want them to certainly be aware of this. So when we come back, I'm going to take a break because we're going to come back and we're going to pick up with the cause and the fallout. And again, I think similar to our last episode, this one's probably going to be a long one, but it's going to be a good one. I think you're going to now begin to get a full understanding of maybe why some of these contentious conversations happen. So hang with us and we'll be right back. All right, coming back from the break, you probably thought you were going to get the conclusion of the San Bruno episode.
Nope.
We came to the realization together that honestly, this was too much to handle in one episode. So you're going to have to come back next week or in 2 weeks to hear us really close out the full impacts. So for instance, we haven't even talked about the NTSB's opinion on stable manufacturing defects.
Yep.
I was significantly surprised at how much content there is around inline inspection in this document, even though line 132 wasn't inspectable. So come back in 2 weeks because we're going to deep dive into that and how that is reflected in current regulation. We hope you enjoy this episode and we look forward to seeing you again in 2 weeks.